contains all the potential of the world.
Right.
And
right.
it's also the spirit of Mercury. Like, it's like, I don't know how she did that. It's just beyond belief that she managed that. I don't know. I really don't know how she did that.
Yeah. It's like the way to understand it, like in terms of a glass, would be like, once you grasp the logos, this is a St. Maximus way of speaking too. Once you grasp the logos, then you are able to, you've captured all the rules and everything else.
But once you understand what a glass is, then you don't have to, you can recognize every glass in the entire world. It's like such a massive power. You've overcome the entire game through getting this one thing, which is like which is often imaged as a seed or as a golden ball or as something sparkling, which you represent like in the world, but is ultimately pointing above it.
Well, that's perhaps that's reflected in the insistence that Adam is to name all the animals, right? In the story of Adam and Eve, because that's obviously kept in the narrative for a reason, and it has to do with the power that naming and subduing, in the sense that you've described, which is the also simultaneous imposition of a hierarchy of categorization that goes along with naming, that gives you a grip on the world. And that grip is associated with a moral necessity and requirement in that story.
It's, for me, the nomological dimension is the naming dimension. Mm-hmm. That's what science does, broadly construed. Yeah. And that's different from telling a story. Naming things is different from telling a story.
But ultimately, this is where I kind of come back again to the conscious.
We'll keep doing this.
We have to not go too far into this because we've been through this down this path before. But so ultimately, because
we are not disembodied beings, like this is, so science, this type of nomological order
is taken from a position where I am, as I see the nomological order, I have to climb the ladder. And so, climb, especially most narratives always have a sense of,
this is Moses on the mountain again.
Yes.
Yes.
But that's why the narrative is always this, like almost all narratives are that. It's you notice the difference. And once you notice the distance, and when you notice the distance,
then you have to reestablish a connection with that, with which you're distant. Because you don't need an ethic unless you notice the difference. You don't need, at least you don't need an explicit ethic. You don't have to
Why?
spell
Why
it out.
not unless you notice the difference?
Because you don't have to tell someone how to go downstairs unless they can't do it. You don't have an explicit set of rules.
Okay, so there has to be an objection. There has to be a problem.
So St. Paul says something like, okay, the law is written on the human heart, which means that it doesn't mean all the laws are written extensively in every detail in the human heart. That is in the human heart, in that little golden ball, in that center, in that place where everything comes together, you contain all the potentiality. Everything that has the through line is contained in that. But now if you notice the difference, then you have to formulate that difference. And then that becomes the laws or just the ways of being. So I can say something at first like, when you're driving a car, like there's specific laws, and then a problem comes up. It's like, actually there's a differentiation here which we have to make, or else there's a problem.
Right, so which means the ethic that's currently...
And it just keeps getting more and more detailed and more and more. So you start with the law, you end up with like this, let's say in Jewish tradition, you end up with this huge compendium of exceptions and like details and everything.
Sure.
But ultimately the idea is that all of that is ultimately contained in something which gathers it all together into one, into this ineffable point that transcends.
I like all of this, but the space in which all the laws are being made and written, that's not a narrative space, right?
So let me go after you on that for a minute.
The Ten Commandments is not a story.
Because right? I don't think that's true.
You think
I think it is a story. That's why that's a good entry point. Okay. That's a good entry point.
Well, there's a story which reveals the Ten Commandments.
Right, but
there's also a story
right,
in
the Ten Commandments aren't. I believe there is a little bit, but I think you're right. But this is why we say that the Ten Commandments is embedded in a story. Without the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt, finding themselves in a desert of nothingness, having to reconnect with the transcendent, that is why the law exists. So the nomological order is embedded in the story. You wouldn't have to.
But the reverse is also the case.
Go ahead.
If God doesn't offer us the nomological order, there's no point for the Exodus in the story, right? Right.
That's okay. We could hypothesize that it comes up from the bottom and down from the top.
This is even before that.
Yeah. Right. We're trying to talk about I'm proposing that the narrative and the nomological and whatever we want to call this self-transcending dimension are irreducible to each other. they're not, none of them can exist independent. That's why I'm using the 3 dimensions metaphor.
Yeah.
Right? They are interdependent, but they're not reducible. So I'm resisting the hypothesis.
I would say that the ontology is not captured inside epistemology, because epistemology cannot reach to the full extent of the multiplicity of ontology. So now why is that relevant to what you just said? That's part of the irreducibility. You're arguing, I think, in some sense, that no matter what the story is, there's something that's real that's beyond that story. Is that okay? So let me put a couple of twists in that. Got it.
Is that okay for you, Jonathan, right now?
No, I think it's fine. We'll keep going.
Okay. So you said there's no story in the 10 Commandments, right? And Jonathan had one objection. I have a different take on that he may appreciate. Maybe you too. When the Pharisees and the scribes are always trying to trap Christ in the Gospels into making a heretical statement or doing something that clearly violates the law. So they call him on healing on the Sabbath, for example.
Yes.
And there's like 10 stories like that where smart people who run on algorithms try to trap him. And it never works, because he does the thing you described, which is he just refers to a higher order principle, or even 3 levels up and says, like, no.
Yes.
But one of the things that happens is the Pharisees come and say, well, here's the Decalogue, which is the most important law. And the trick there is, no matter what he says the others are less important, and so now he's a heretic, and they get to take him away. And he says, put God above all else and love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's all of the laws are derived from that spirit. And that spirit is a story, and that story is the Logos. And so
that's the move that I don't want to slow it down, Jordan.
Okay.
Expand that up. I get that's the spirit. I totally get that.
Well, then the question is, what is the spirit?
But why is the spirit necessarily a story?
Well, I don't know why it's necessarily a story, but I know that it's necessarily a story in that context, because the spirit that Christ is referring to that unites the Decalogue is the Logos. And the whole biblical corpus, the narrative that spans the entire biblical corpus, is the account of the elaboration of that spirit across time and its embodied incarnation. And that presents itself as a story. And I think the reason for that is that it just, I mean, I understand your point. I understand the point that you're making now. And so
I'm actually understanding your point better than I've ever understood it before.
Right.
Because
well, you're talking about that which transcends the current narrative, and that has to be there, or there's no reality. So, okay, let's